In 1854, cholera was rife in the city of London. And for people who became infected with it, the symptoms were pretty horrible. Diarrhea, leading to dehydration, resulting in death. And an extraordinarily high percentage of the afflicted population did die, around 12% of those contracting the disease. The main driver of the outbreak was the underdeveloped sewage system throughout the city, which allowed raw sewage to mix with sources of drinking water. But all of this was totally unknown in the 1850s, since people primarily believed in the miasma theory of disease, and that ascribes diseases of this kind to bad air. Modern germ theory, which would have identified the source as bacteria in the drinking water, hadn't yet overturned miasma theory. And this means that the terrible disease was running unchecked through neighborhoods, including an especially bad outbreak in the Broad Street area of the Soho district, where 127 people had died painfully in that one year. Enter the now famous John Snow. John Snow is considered one of the fathers of modern epidemiology, which studies the patterns, distribution, and effects of disease. And he was raised in one of the poorest neighborhoods in York, but he'd risen up from the coal-shoveling working class by mastering surgery and becoming an expert in hygiene. By the 1850s, he was practicing medicine for many of the elites in London. Confronted with the outbreak, he set about advancing his own favorite explanation, germ theory, and he was able to track the disease to its source, which was a single well on Broad Street used by all the victims of the disease. So how did he do it? And the answer is, unsurprisingly, geography. He did it through careful and rigorous spatial detective work, using grounded observation and the power of mapping to figure out and to communicate what was going on. So in this lecture, I'll follow on the lessons of John Snow to demonstrate that disease is a spatial phenomenon. Using the classic case of the Broad Street cholera outbreak of 1854, I'll introduce the concept of spatial epidemiology, and I'll then demonstrate what the movement of diseases, including West Nile virus and SARS, tells us about these diseases, but also about our global vulnerability to pandemics, worldwide epidemics fostered by our interconnected world. Finally, I'll show that while diseases are often very global in scope, there's a terrific unevenness to their distributions. Using the case of HIV/AIDS, I'll show that vulnerability to disease is a product of social and economic and political conditions. So, let's go back to Broad Street now and follow in the footsteps of John Snow. How did he crack the case? Living nearby the site of the epidemic, Snow first entered the Broad Street neighborhood and took a case history of each of the households that had experienced cholera. He went from house to house and he asked people who had died, what people did, and what business they went about in their lives, especially water collection. Examining the proximity of each of these households, he scoured the streets in the densest areas of the cholera cases and located that single well that all of the cases clearly encircled. And then he performed some further examinations of the well water and was convinced that this was the source of the disease. He approached the authorities in the area, the Board of Guardians of St. James Parish, and requested they shut down the pump. And though hesitant to do so, they removed the handle after some persuasion, and cholera in the neighborhood ceased. To further press his point, Snow then published a map of the epidemic, showing all 13 public wells in the vicinity, as well as the locations of all the recent cholera deaths in the area, some 578 deaths in total, so a big deal. And in this terrific and now very famous map, he put a small black rectangle at the residence of each deceased victim. Residences that had multiple deaths had a big stack of these black rectangles, and the immediate pattern is unmistakable even to the untrained eye. A real and prominent cluster of black bars appears around that single well, the one on Broad Street. You can go to that site today and see the wellhead memorialized there, and even a greater honor in such a city of fine drinking establishments, the John Snow Pub can now be found facing the well site. This is a well-known case, and it's a good one for review since it shows a lot of the important strengths of geographical methods. First, it shows the power of fieldwork. Though ultimately Snow would convince the public of the rightness of his theory through analytical mapping, his first effort involved getting into the neighborhoods and talking to residents. In fact, he learned that several who had been spared the disease worked in a brewery where they could drink beer and didn't rely on well water. And only by performing this sort of footwork, what we would later call shoe leather epidemiology, he could confirm to his satisfaction the source of the disease. This is a central part of geographic methods in all kinds of geography to this day, fieldwork. That method was coupled with the singularly most powerful tool he had at his disposal, a very well-made map. As we noted many, many lectures ago, maps, though always partial and inevitably biased, are an extraordinarily powerful and useful tool both for analysis and also for rhetoric, for convincing people. In this case, it was the map, after all, that had won the argument for snow. For our purposes, the most important lessons from the cholera case are that disease, like everything else, is spatial, and it's spatial in very important ways. This underlines a more general geographic principle. The where of something, how it's distributed, may reveal its why. In this case, studying the distribution of cholera provides good evidence that it's a waterborne disease, as it's coming from that well. But the principle applies more generally. In biogeography, the clustering of a species may hint at its preferred habitat. In economic geography, the clustering of certain industries may suggest the constraining logistical or transportation limits on production. Where may tell you why. Now, this intuitive principle underlies a lot of forms of geographical investigation and methodology, even if it's sometimes used in far more theoretically or mathematically complex applications. Applied to the problem of disease, this principle is called spatial epidemiology, and that's the study of the geographic distributions of diseases and disease cases to predict, control, and understand sickness and health. And this can include several different things. First, simple mapping of disease, as in the case of John Snow's cholera, provides a pretty powerful health tool and a good place to explore disease. This beats the heck out of looking at data in a big table because your eyes have the ability to pull out subtle spatial patterns and allow you to ask new questions. Now, more sophisticated approaches exist, of course. Geographic correlation can be used to explore the relationship between a specific form of disease and the environmental, demographic, or economic conditions that prevail where you find that disease. Take, for example, the incidence of a disease like valley fever. This is a sickness characterized by a terrible fever and a cough, headaches, often progressing to a very serious illness and then death, especially in older people. The incidence of the disease can be mapped in geographic areas like census blocks or counties or other spatial units. And in each of these same spatial units, you might collect data on, for example, geology. Now, if you ran a statistical correlation between these data sets, overlaying the incidence of valley fever with the characteristics of the land surface, you'd be likely to see that valley fever is prevalent mostly where loose soil and dust prevails in outdoor areas. And this is because the disease agent is a fungus that thrives in dry soils, which when kicked up into the air, come to reside in people's lungs, causing the disease. The key point is that maps can be used for more than just description. They can be used to test the relationships between disease and other attributes of places, leading to an actual explanation of what causes the illness. So, mapping disease gives us a lot of power in explanation. A natural next question is, if we're so good at explaining, can we use these same spatial relationships for predicting disease? The answer is yes, but it's a lot harder. First, we need much more powerful tools. We need data collected over long periods of time, snapshots of the distribution of an illness at different moments, which allows us to track it as it unfolds. But to make any meaningful predictions, we'd also need to have a really strong sense of how the disease is transmitted, how it moves over space, and if it's infectious, how it's transferred between hosts. Consider the case of West Nile virus. West Nile is a disease that belongs to the Flaviviridae family and is carried by mosquitoes. Typically, we find the disease in tropical parts of the world, and it gets its name from the site where it first was discovered in the 1930s. It was discovered in what is today Uganda, in the westernmost branch of the upper part of the Nile River, West Nile virus. The flavivirus can produce a number of illnesses, a whole range of sickness, but one of the most common forms is West Nile fever, which includes a serious fever, chills, joint pain, swollen lymph nodes, and flu-like symptoms. People infected with the virus can also contract a more serious neurological disease. Though the disease isn't typically fatal, deaths from West Nile virus are possible. 2012 was the deadliest year in the history of the disease, and it killed 286 people in the United States alone. But what's most interesting about West Nile, from a geographical point of view, is that it's really quite new to North America, and especially to the United States. So by tracking it geographically from its arrival on U.S. shores to its nationwide spread in the last few years, you'll learn a lot about how the disease works. Though prediction again remains, up to now, an elusive goal. The first case of West Nile in North America was reported in New York City in the late summer of 1999. And within weeks, dozens of crows, a number of cormorants, some flamingos, pheasants, and other birds all contracted some kind of unidentifiable encephalitis. And early that fall, human cases of an unknown disease were also reported across New York and in nearby parts of New Jersey. By the end of the year, the Centers for Disease Control identified the disease as West Nile, new to the U.S., and rarely seen outside of Africa, Australia, and the Near East. Though they made a noble effort to contain the disease before the next mosquito season, the year 2000 brought with it a whole bunch more cases of death across cases of the disease and death across New York, New Jersey, and now into New England. In 2001, cases were reported up and down the eastern seaboard, especially in Florida. The rapid geographic diffusion of the disease has everything to do with its etiology, the system of causes and the origins of the disease. As I've suggested from the original cases in New York City, the main vectors for the disease, its primary carriers in other words, are birds. Birds with the disease, bitten by mosquitoes, pass the virus to the mosquitoes. When the same infected mosquito bites another bird, the bird catches the disease, and so on. As it turns out, people and other species, like horses, can certainly catch the disease and can suffer from it, but for complex reasons, they can't pass it back on. So a mosquito with the disease biting you or me may give us the disease, but then bitten by another mosquito, we won't pass that infection on back to a new host. We're basically a dead end. This means that the geography of the disease that we see in the first few years is one dominated by the movement of birds, their migrations and middle distance flying habits. This accounts strongly for the passage of the disease at first up and down the Atlantic coast. That's birds moving around. And in 2002 and 2003, the disease broke out in a serious way west of the Appalachians, and then into the greater Midwest and western mountain regions. And this fast rate of spread has got everything to do with the infectious nature of the virus. It's the ease with which it moves between bird hosts and mosquito vectors, but also the wide-ranging flight of birds. In the year after, advancing into the late 2000s and into the current decade, we see West Nile as basically now endemic to North America. It's a disease that moves around in its frequency and seriousness across the map, but it's a problem in the US and Canada now forever. So, can we predict where we're going to find West Nile virus next? This is a hotly debated question in virology and geography alike, but the uneven and jumpy nature of the disease makes it hard to track at the national or statewide scale. It is true, however, that at the local scale, people are at greater risk of contracting the disease if they're exposed to the mosquitoes that carry the disease. It's intuitive. This means that areas near stagnant water or warm, damp undergrowth present more of the risk. Some of the geographic features may be natural, like a shallow pond or a seasonal stream bed, but other features may be entirely man-made, like a stormwater culvert or an overwatered lawn. One of the mosquitoes that carries West Nile virus has the capacity to reproduce in a paper cup. So in that way, the West Nile case shows the more general issue about disease geography. Clearly, people are affected by the disease differently based on their location, their geographic context. Areas with geographies that favor mosquito breeding present a higher disease risk for people who live there and have a serious impact on regional health outcomes. On the other hand, people are constantly remaking these geographies and can actually create the very conditions that put them at risk. I'll give you a great example. A few years ago, when conducting interviews about West Nile virus, researchers working in my team spoke with a health manager in Reno, Nevada. Now, he explained that his job had become much, much harder since 2008, and that mosquito populations and complaints had mushroomed since then, along with concerns about West Nile and other mosquito-borne diseases. So why? Why since 2008? Well, we asked, and as it turns out, the economic downturn in 2008, especially in the housing market, led to widespread and large-scale abandonment of homes. You following me? Many of these homes, as is typical in parts of the desert West, had pools and hot tubs. And these were all abandoned by their owners, and they turned green and stagnant. Now, unsurprisingly, a green stagnant pool or hot tub is a terrific place for the mosquitoes that can carry the West Nile virus. An abandoned hot tub can host thousands and thousands of mosquito larvae, resulting in mosquito hotspots scattered throughout neighborhoods. So complaints from people in areas with abandoned pools became a significant problem for health managers in the region. The disease risk was a product of an interaction between a built environment and a previously unpredictable economic transition. Again, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that our geographic context determines much about our life and health risks, but that context is often the result of human activity and modification. We can basically create our own risk. So far, we've shown that disease is, by its nature, a spatial phenomenon, and that spatial epidemiology can help us track and explain diseases. We've also seen how disease vectors, the carriers, the distributors of disease, are critical in defining the geographical extent and trajectory of diseases. And the West Nile case underlines yet another, more global geographic point. Here's a disease endemic to Africa that has come to be part of the overall disease profile of the United States. How is that possible? Clearly, the disease traveled like wildfire through the domestic bird population, but how did the West Nile virus get to North America in the first place? It's impossible to know for sure whether a bird carried the disease into the region by flying in or not, but one very likely possibility is that the disease was brought into the region accidentally in a smuggled-in exotic animal. The international exotic pet trade is a multi-billion-dollar business, after all. So the simple fact of increasing economic connectedness, like the animal trade, between far-flung parts of the planet increases the possible ways that diseases, usually through the animals or people that carry them, can get around. So globalization of commerce and international jet travel mean that a disease never before seen in one part of the world can be present in a new human population simply as a result of a 12-hour plane ride. And this increases the probability of a global pandemic. That's an epidemic spread across wide regions or multiple continents. Now, pandemics aren't new, of course. The Black Death of the 14th century killed as many as 75 million people as it traveled from Asia to Europe, affecting a huge swath of humanity. The Spanish influenza of 1918, that was also global in scope. It may have been brought to North America by soldiers returning from World War I in Europe. But in this day and age, where global travel and global commerce and global connections are so much faster and more intense than ever before, the opportunities for diseases to have global reach are going to be greater. One of the major pandemic scares of recent years, SARS, that's severe acute respiratory syndrome, demonstrates this. SARS is another virus, this one caused by the so-called SARS coronavirus. The disease presents itself as a fierce fever and a respiratory ailment. It can be identified by chest x-rays, and its fatality is fairly high among people infected, between 9 and 12%. So again, a pretty high level depending on their age. Most important for our purposes here, though, SARS is transmitted by air, meaning proximity to a sick person can allow exposure to SARS. And the most startling thing about the disease, and the reason it caused worldwide panic, was the speed with which it went from a very local outbreak to a global one. The first cases of the disease were probably a handful of people in rural China, farming communities, probably as early as 2002. By the end, there'd be more than 8,000 reported cases of the disease worldwide and 775 deaths, spread over dozens of countries in 2003. So how did it spread, and how did it spread so quickly? The detective work here is complex, but the disease probably skipped out of rural China in 2002. An American businessman on a flight to Singapore died of the disease in early 2003, and the medical staff that treated him in Hanoi caught the disease, and this set off a global alert. But by then, it was too late. Cases were already being reported in Toronto, and in San Francisco, and in Manila, and Hong Kong, with the disease bouncing through hospitals and hotels, propelled by long-distance travel. Global health authorities, like the World Health Organization, responded to the disease in a specifically spatial way. releasing travel warnings, and seeking to slow the rate of the movement of people in an effort to slow the rate of the disease. The last reported case of the disease was 2004, though other viruses have circulated in the years since. The bottom line in the SARS case is the way the global system, as an integrated network of free trade and largely unrestricted travel, is one that makes disease geographies extremely difficult to govern. The sudden emergence of MERS, which is another coronavirus, in the Middle East in 2012 raised similar enormous and immediate fears. How do we spatially contain a disease in the age of global travel? Well, none of this is to say that disease risks are universally and indiscriminately greater now for everyone than they were in the past. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. People in the world are living longer, with better access to health care and better health treatment than ever before. The World Health Organization reports that global life expectancy increased from 64 years in just 1990 to 70 years in 2011. The world is actually healthier than ever. What it suggests instead is that pandemics, rapidly spreading infectious diseases, are a higher risk now for all of us on Earth than they were before the days of hub-and-spoke air travel and global shipping and relatively porous national boundaries. The spatiality and the geography of the disease is more important now than ever before. And this spatiality is especially acute for the most vulnerable populations on the planet. So for the very last part of this lecture, I want to reflect on this final reality. Some places and populations are more vulnerable to disease than others. Really, this question is merely providing further evidence of what we've already learned. As with the rise of cholera, disease is unevenly distributed at local, regional, and global scales. But the things that make some places more susceptible to disease often have little to do with the characteristics or qualities of the disease itself, but instead impinge on the social, economic, and political conditions through which the disease travels. No disease demonstrates this better than HIV/AIDS. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, as is well known, is caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. The disease is transmitted through unprotected sex, used or reused hypodermic needles, contaminated blood transfusions, and can also be passed from mother to child during pregnancy. And since the disease stormed onto the scene in the early 1980s, it's estimated to have killed around 30 million people. That's a startling figure. The disease is ubiquitous. It can be found everywhere and amongst all populations of the world, meaning that it isn't a disease of gay people or straight people or drug users or white people or black people. As researchers Tony Barnett and Pierce Blakey, who researched the geography of AIDS in Africa, once famously wrote, it's simply a disease of people. But if you glance at a map of the current distribution of the disease, it shows a radical unevenness. Something's going on here, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, which has allowed the disease to expand rapidly and unchecked, at least until recently. The adult prevalence of the disease throughout all of sub-Saharan Africa is around 5%, compared to around 0.5% in North America, where the epidemic remains still very serious. In southernmost Africa, the prevalence rate exceeds 20%. This disease is simply everywhere in South Africa and Botswana, impacting every part of society and economy. But why? Well, there are a number of reasons that these, the most impoverished nations on Earth, would be the sites for the most rapid spread of the disease. Today, the rates of people testing positive for HIV based on blood tests, which is called the seroprevalence rate, are highest. They're highest in countries with higher teenage birth rates, higher fertility rates, and fewer women using contraceptives. As we've learned in a previous lecture, these are all precisely the parts of the world that have experienced high levels of underdevelopment, for many of the same reasons. Countries with high HIV seroprevalence also tend to have fewer doctors and less access to essential medications. All of these precisely characterize the conditions of southern Africa. In highly rural populations, moreover, with high levels of subsistence agriculture, often isolated from the infrastructural investments that larger cities and wealthier regions receive, these conditions are quite typical. Poor medical facilities and limited education exacerbate the problem, along with others, including the reuse of needles. The proximate drivers of the spread of the disease are also closely linked to the desperation and poverty associated with underdevelopment. For example, the practice of women depending on multiple partners for support, which is common in areas of Africa with crushing poverty, tends to accelerate the rate of infection in populations. And much of the same can be said of Thailand, a country with the highest seroprevalence rates in Southeast Asia, where the sex trade thrives amidst poverty and extremely limited economic opportunities, especially for women. Where little political will has been exerted to empower women and let them protect and advance themselves, this problem only becomes worse. A map of high AIDS rates in the population is a map of economic poverty, but also political vulnerability. And the widespread presence of the disease does a lot to reinforce the exact same problems of underdevelopment that cause it to spread in the first place. As the work of Barnett and Blakey demonstrated in their path-breaking study of AIDS in Africa, when members of rural households contract AIDS and die of the disease, the household economy is usually thrown into disarray. This leads to further impoverishment and a downward spiral in income from one generation to the next, resulting in higher rates of vulnerability and infection in the next generation. So poverty and AIDS have a mutually reinforcing relationship. AIDS, in this sense, is more than just a global pandemic. It actually has the remarkable capacity to seek out some of the poorest, most economically challenged, and most politically marginalized populations and places in the world. This is a disease, in other words, with a track record of highlighting spatial injustice. So I've demonstrated here that disease is a very spatial phenomenon. I've also shown that by mapping and analyzing the geography of disease, we can learn a great deal about the character of disease itself, as well as the social and economic contexts through which disease travels. Thinking about disease through the lens of spatial epidemiology, as in the case of West Nile virus, provides us with insights into both the natural factors that account for the spread of the disease, like bird migrations, as well as the human ones, like abandoned swimming pools. I've also shown that, as in the case of SARS, the circulation of diseases is often accelerated by our increasingly interconnected and globalized world. Finally, I've demonstrated that the geography of disease is profoundly influenced by social, economic, and political vulnerability. As for the geographies of climate and land use and agriculture, I've tried to show that people and societies are deeply affected by the distribution of disease. But, exactly as for those other geographies, the distribution of disease is itself the result of other human actions and conditions. HIV/AIDS, most notably, has had a profound impact on the economic development of some of the regions of the world in the last 30 years. At the same time, these economic conditions set the stage for the persistence of the disease. The geography of disease reinforces this fundamental lesson that people are made by geographies, but those geographies are often made by people. And with that lesson in mind, we turn now to address the way global forces often impact very local environments. And this insight is referred to by geographers as political ecology, and we turn to it next.